I've never in my entire life woken up in the morning and thought to myself, darn, I got to go do therapy with people today. Never. It just seems amazing that we get to have these deep, intimate, hopefully helpful conversations with people. They're about ourselves developing in different kinds of ways, to lift others around with us. What a blessing to be able to do it.
Okay, life can be crazy. You're feeling like you're sinking, just trying to find a meaning. It's time for better thinking, yeah, better thinking. Time to tune in. Let's go.
Dr. Rick Hanson is my guest for today's episode. He's a psychologist and senior fellow of the Greater Good Science Center at UC Berkeley and also New York Times bestselling author. His books include Neurodharma, which is his most recent, Resilient, Hardwiring Happiness, and Buddha's Brain. It was an absolute pleasure to not only interview but also pick Rick's brain in regards to how we might be able to do life better, particularly regarding how to deal with negative experiences and turn towards those things that we all really cherish and yearn in our heart, the experiences that are positive and meaningful in our lives. Rick has a real practical way of discussing this topic and things that we can do in our own personal lives to live better and let go of those things that are hard. I know you're going to enjoy this episode. I certainly did. So I'd just like to say enjoy, and please give us a thumbs up and a review at the end of this if you enjoyed this episode. Rick, a big thank you for coming on to the show.
Nesh, it's a pleasure to be here. Kindred spirits. I'm very fond of Australia, and so I'm glad. Thank you for having me.
Look, it's really exciting to be talking to a fellow psychologist, a neuropsych. I know that you've got a wealth of experience and have written quite a number of books. Most recent one, talking about Neurodharma, the title, looking at peak sort of experiences and, yearnings of one's heart and how to go out and become closer, more connected with that. And also your other work in really resilience and which is grounded in neuroplasticity and how to go out and in actual fact use evidence-based work to embrace that, to enhance those experiences, because we are surrounded these days by so much negativity. And I'm just excited to be speaking with you to find out more about those topics.
Excellent. It's great. It's some of my favorite stuff, honestly. And I don't know about you. So I'm a longtime practicing therapist, although lately I've kind of been more focused on writing and doing online kind of teaching. I've had jobs of different kinds where I was not that excited about going to work in the morning, but I did it. I went to work. It was okay. I've never in my entire life woken up in the morning and thought to myself, darn, I got to go do therapy with people today. Never. It just seems amazing that we get to have these deep, intimate, hopefully helpful conversations with people. They're about ourselves developing in different kinds of ways, to lift others around with us. What a blessing to be able to do it.
Absolutely. I always say I can see, 7 to 10 clients. It's not an issue whatsoever. I actually feel extremely fulfilled but energized. I know that others, might find that a large load, but for me, the admin work, the paperwork is
right.
what
the
really
billing.
drains. Yeah, it just
the insurance work.
Saps my energy. But seeing clients and having deep, meaningful conversations is really enthralling, energizing.
Yeah, beautiful.
How did you get into your work? I know that you've been meditating for a long time, and there must be that crossover between obviously your professional life and your personal journey as well. How did you marry up those two worlds?
I think like a lot of therapists, I was not very happy as a kid. And like a lot of people drawn to the helping professions, I wanted to understand and help myself. And also I wanted to help other people because I could see other people around me who were stressed, worried, frazzled, and blue. I was not traumatized as a kid, and I think there are many people who've had a much worse childhood and life than I had. I'm not trying to equate them. That said, I had a certain amount of suffering. So that set me on my way. And then I landed in college right in the middle of the human potential movement in the very early 1970s in America and California. I don't know what it was like in Australia then, but, and that just kind of carried me along. And it seemed really cool and exciting. Initially, standard clinical psychology seemed very boring and behavioristic. No offense to rats and mazes, but it just was not as exciting as, pounding on tables with towels, yelling out loud, and doing all kinds of things. So that's kind of where I began. But all along, even though it took me a while to realize it, I had always loved having a conversation with someone that was helpful for them, that explored whatever was going on, maybe had some advice in it on my part, welcome or unwelcome, skillful or unskillful, but a little bit of that. But mostly it was just unpacking, unwrapping, disentangling the knots of suffering and unhappiness. And I finally realized as I approached my 30th birthday that that's really what I ought to do. So that then took me back into graduate school, initially in developmental psychology to really understand the roots of the psyche, and then into a variety of clinical trainings, eventually getting my doctorate. And kind of that's where I took off, in professional terms. Along the way, it had also really seemed to me that the contemplatives around the world, the so-called Olympic athletes of mental training, had something to offer us. They had meditated, they had quieted the mind, they had peered deeply into it in a variety of traditions. And if they're all kind of pointing in the same direction, even in different ways and culturally influenced ways, sometimes religiously influenced ways, but if they're more or less pointing at the same moon, you start to think, whoa, that might be a pretty cool moon, or at least head in that direction. So I did start meditating in 1974, and it was pretty sentimental and chaotic and not that fruitful, and I wandered around for a while. But after about 10 years passed or so, and I was edging into my 30s, I started practicing in a more formal Buddhist frame, especially drawing on the original teachings of the Buddha, which are highly psychological, not very religious, if religious at all, and very pragmatic, very practical, very immediate. And that's kind of where it all began for me. And then I would just, finish my story. In the last 20 years, as neuroscience has exploded, especially the last 10, I've been really interested in the intersection then of these three strands, these three lineages or traditions of wisdom: modern psychology, the perennial wisdom of the ages in terms of contemplative practice, and modern brain science. When you put those three together and think about the intersection of those three circles, there's just fantastically useful information and tools that regular people can use in the midst of everyday life, and clinicians can certainly use to help people more effectively.
I think there's this really fascinating space that I hear from a lot of psychologists that I'm hearing in your story as well, this kind of movement towards the same moon. As we read further and further and, broader and broader, we recognize some similar traits in much of the teachings out there or learnings out there that have been passed on. I've sort of found that intersection for myself in, the acceptance and commitment therapy world.
Yeah. That's beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's a huge intersection with, I think with, that some of those Buddhist philosophies as well. And, using evidence-based research to validate, the processes or what is it that underpins change or growth or, connecting with the, who and what's important. So it's interesting to hear your story.
Yeah, I'd like to stress a couple of points here. That first, what I'll call contemplative practice, primarily experiential, penetrating, motivated, disciplined, that grapples with the universal human body and the universal human mind, which then is conditioned and takes its form in ways that are culturally situated, certainly. But we've all got the fundamental human DNA that generates a human body with a human nervous system and brain, and we share fundamental qualities of the same human mind. So a person can be very interested in contemplative wisdom without being necessarily allied with any particular tradition or necessarily embedded in even a religious approach. In other words, one can, I think, reasonably extract insights from Sufism or Judaism or atheistic mindfulness and consider them on their merits and then apply them as one chooses or not. So that I would say that in general, I personally have my greatest training, I would say, in Buddhist contemplative practice. I've spoken with people in particular who are grounded in Christian practice and Sufi practice and Hindu practice, and to some extent, the practices of the first people around the world. The native people in Australia, the native people in the Americas, the indigenous or first people around the world have themselves a profound contemplative tradition that's full of wisdom. So that would be kind of part one for me. And then part two, as a therapist, if people walk in my door and expect clinical psychology for something, you know, their family issue, I've worked with kids, I've worked with couples and adults, a pretty broad practice, they're not coming in the door to get a Buddhist lecture. It's like, and if I were, I think it's appropriate. There's some people who do Christian counseling, and that's the frame, and it's explicit, it's understood, and it's helpful, hopefully, inside that frame. So as someone who, you know, is somewhat identified with Buddha's brain, you know, the title in my most recent book, Neurodharma, Dharma, you know, is a term out of India,
Sure.
not necessarily restricted to Buddhism, but still Eastern. I just want to be really clear. I think it's very important to not preach at our clients unless they're there for that, and they're not. My clients are not there for that. That said, the Buddha has no monopoly on the value of mindfulness, or the importance of compassion, or the value of recognizing that all experiences are changing, right? And you don't have to be a card-carrying, quote-unquote, Buddhist to be able to share those useful ideas with people and to help them develop those as personal qualities.
Yeah, I love that idea, and it's something that I think I've heard, you know, in different forms. It's really what we're doing is assisting people to contemplate their lives from different perspectives, and whatever it is that's going to be easiest to grapple with as a starting point, and to broaden that in our therapy. There's, I suppose, a lot to be said these days around process-based therapy as well. That obviously looks far beyond, you know, whether it's CBT or ACT or schema therapy. Kind of saying, if we just stop and pause, what are we doing? You know, and taking the time to consider our lives, you know, from different perspectives, and why we've formed particular ideas or rules or thoughts. You know, it still comes from that very same place of, you know, contemplating our lives. And what's drawn me to having you on the show is the way that you've spoken about that, you know, particularly in your resilience work from your TED Talk as well, of I suppose in some sense trying to balance between, you know, all the, if I can call it, negative experiences that we're exposed to try and find something that's a little bit more longer lasting around, whether it be happiness or satisfaction or strength, you know, inner growth, whatever language we put to it, but something that's, you know, more touching the yearnings of our heart, so to speak. Maybe I can pick your brain a little bit about you know, some of the neurological processes that you know need to be considered to, for lack of a better word, but to not even combat, but not to fight with the world as it is, but rather find a new world within ourselves.
Well, that's really beautifully said, I think. Gosh, there's so many different useful ways to go here, right? And you are alluding to a few of my kind of greatest hits, as it were, and giving me the nod in different directions. So, which I appreciate actually. I guess I would say that for me, maybe I'll tell a personal story that would kind of ground it. When I was a teenager, about age 15, and I know roughly how old I was when this happened, I was very unhappy, and it all seemed hopeless. I was stuck. I didn't know how to change. I didn't know how to talk to kids. I was very shy, painfully self-conscious, socially awkward. A lot of residues of bottled up feelings. My parents were loving and decent, but they weren't very empathic by their nature, including just their own background growing up in hard conditions in the Depression in America. And I skipped a grade and I was very young going through school, so I was an outsider much of the time and lonely and all the rest. And it just seemed hopeless and terrible. And then what came to me was this realization that no matter how bad the past was, or even how bad the present was, I could always learn a little every day. I could grow a little, I could let go a little, I could develop a little, I could acquire skills, I could cultivate a little bit every day. I could learn how to be a little less shy around big, aggressive boys. I could learn how to be a little more comfortable around girls. I'm a cisgender, heterosexual guy. I could learn how to not react so much to my parents, and I could learn how to let go of some of the sadness that I was carrying around, this big bucket of tears. And that was incredibly hopeful, that I could learn, and that it was within my power to learn a little every day, to develop a little every day. Incredibly hopeful. And so then if the great opportunity is to learn, in many ways, the skill of skills, the superpower of superpowers is learning itself, because it's the one that grows the rest of them. So learning how to learn becomes the most important learning of all. And I mean learning in the broad sense, especially social, emotional, somatic, motivational, attitudinal, even spiritual kinds of learning, more than book learning. And so then I've spent my career, I think, in many, many ways, trying to understand the process, really, of lasting change for the better, that kind of learning. What's the actual process, speaking of process, whereby people genuinely heal from trauma, they don't carry it around, they genuinely disengage from certain habits of reactivity, they let go of certain addictive cravings, and in particular, they acquire over time secure attachment, greater trait mindfulness, positive mood, happiness, gratitude, resilience, wisdom, love. How do they do that? And that then takes us into the process of neuroplastic change. That, in other words, we can consider this question without reference to the brain, as people 2,500 years ago did, or as Freud did. Freud was a neurologist. His first couple of books were actually on the nervous system, but he really functioned as a psychoanalyst without much knowledge of what's actually going on in the hardware. But today, increasingly, we can really understand in the hardware, how does the hardware change? How does change happen in the nervous system that underlies therapeutic growth, let's say? How does that actually happen, or personal growth in general? And we now understand that it's a two-step process, two-stage process, essentially. It almost entirely involves conscious processes of experiencing. We can grow through unconscious processes, but very minimally. It's mainly based on what do we experience in the moment. So we must first experience whatever we want to grow, including experiencing a release, because that's what we want to grow. We want to grow traits of release. And then second, critically important, that otherwise passing, transient experience must leave lasting physical traces behind and in alterations of neural structure and function. Otherwise, momentarily pleasant, momentarily useful, but zero lasting value in terms of the any kind of internal acquisition of positive change for the better. And that second step of the necessary two-step process of learning is the one we routinely forget, and one I forgot a million times as a therapist myself working with people. My clients will be having a useful thought or feeling or intention in my office, but by the time they hit the stairs outside my door or their car in the parking lot, it had vanished, kapoof. Or certainly by the next morning when they woke up and growled at their kid and kicked the dog, or not literally, but maybe,
Sure.
Yet again. And so that's where I've developed a lot of material in Hardwiring Happiness and in my other books about self-directed neuroplasticity, to use the phrase from Jeffrey Schwartz of UCLA. How do we actually internally engage our experiences in such a way that they have the greatest lasting impact? So, for example, last night as I was going to bed, I kind of dropped into an experience of a kind of selfless love where I wasn't caught up in my reactions to other people. I just felt really kind of flowing and radiating in all directions. I wanted to slow that down to let it really, really sink in. And in much the same way, as we go through our day, if we have a moment of feeling cared about by another person, or if we have a moment of feeling our worth, or a moment of recognizing how to be more skillful, let's say with another person. I'll have interactions with my wife where I'm realizing, ruh-roh, I need to go a different way here, or shift gears, or let go of something, or use a different word, or so forth. And I try to learn from that. So the next time it happens, it's more natural for me to operate in a different way. So how does that actually happen? How does that process of growth happen? And maybe to finish, I've written a lot about it, material about it, and it's really grounded in brain science, but there's a shocking lack of research on what people can do themselves to steepen their personal growth curve of social emotional learning. There's a lot of work in schools about learning to learn. Children and students and young adults in college, older adults in college, learning how to acquire conceptual information, semantic knowledge, so-called, more efficiently. Like they can learn how to be better learners. But we don't do that in the world of mindfulness training, self-compassion training, compassion training, psychotherapy, coaching, counseling, human resources training. We spend almost no time whatsoever teaching the people in our various programs, or our clients or patients, let's say. We spend almost no time whatsoever teaching them how to become active agents of their own personal growth curve in general, and also applied to the particular situation in which we find ourselves with them. And I think that's an enormous missed opportunity. And the how of it is really simple generally. Stay with the experience for a breath or longer, feel it in your body, and focus on what feels good about it, what's rewarding or meaningful about it. And there are other things as well that I go through in a lot of detail in my book, some ways that you can increase the conversion rate from state to trait. That's what we're really talking about here. But the essence of it is really quite simple. Stay with it. Keep those neurons firing together so they wire together more. Feel it in your entire body so they're firing extensively in ways that are integrated with somatic processes. And be aware of what's useful or beneficial or enjoyable about the experience to really, really, really help it sink in. Any single time we do that is rarely life-changing, but the slow accumulation of increments of learning to make the difference between a growth curve in life that's essentially flat or one that's actually as steep as possible.
Is that what you mean by learning, just to make sure I've understood?
And thank you for letting me just do that whole little rant.
No. That's why you're here, so I can pick your brain. The learning component. Does it mean our capacity or our ability to have a new experience or new?
That's the easy part.
Stick.
Experiences are easy.
Yeah. Is it about the
hard.
stickiness? If it's sticky, it stays with us beyond that moment. It actually integrates, so I can use it afterwards. So if I embrace it, if I fully immerse myself in it and potentially reflect or appreciate it for what it is, it's likely to, and let's say I repeat that, it's likely to stick with me and actually go to trait. So, if I stay in the state and I spend some time and energy and, embrace it for what it is, it's more likely to become, trait at a later. Is that what we're talking about?
Yeah, people who are effective, and I'm sure you are effective. First, the way I would put it, think about factors. What are the factors that increase the conversion from states to traits, or to help experiences literally alter neural structure or function? Okay, there's a lot of research about external factors that tend to do that. In other words, how do you teach rats faster where the cheese is, or where the cat urine smell is, right? How do you do that? And we understand a little bit that if people do certain kinds of activities, the behavioral factors of learning. So we have the environmental factors of social emotional learning, then we have the behavioral factors, right? But those are not yet mental experiential factors. And if we look to mental factors, we see two kinds of mental factors of social emotional learning. One is what I would call contextual factors, like the person's openness, or curiosity. These are contextual factors. And then we have what could be called engagement factors, what people actually do with the experiences they're having at the time. So if we study people who are really effective therapists, they might, let's say, create a relationship field, that people talk about as one of the major common factors. I'll call that that's an environmental factor. And to some extent, inside the mind of a client, that feeling of being in the presence of unconditional positive regard, to use the Carl Rogers phrase. Yeah. Or to feel that there is a therapeutic alliance. That's a contextual factor. That's great. So let's play here. Let me give you an example.
Sure.
You're my therapist. I'm your client. I walk in the door, and let's just say we have a good working alliance. I feel like I'm in the presence of unconditional positive regard. Check those boxes. Tick, tick, tick. And let's suppose also that I have some decent mindfulness. I'm aware of my own experiencing. And I tell you that my kind of therapeutic issue in general is that I feel inadequate, less than others a lot. I compare myself to others a lot. And I grew up in a fault-finding home, and I had lots of experiences of loneliness and exclusion, as a kid, all of which are true. And so now I want your help, Doc, with how I can feel better about myself, have more of a genuine feeling of self-worth deep down inside, and less sense of just, being less than other people and kind of a bad person. So then I tell you, well, Doc, when I'm with you, I feel like you genuinely care about me. I mean, I know you're my psychologist and I pay you money and it's okay, and I'm not being creepy. I'm not going to stalk you, but I feel like you actually care about me. Right there, I'm having an experience. The song is playing in my inner iPod, right? I'm having a state that's very relevant to my clinical issue of not feeling regarded, attuned to, absence of healthy narcissistic supplies and so forth. Right? So then what happens? And this is really interesting to me. Usually what happens, now I'm stepping out of the role play, usually what happens is the client starts to feel something they long for and either move on to something else, or the therapist moves them on to something else, or a defense arises, I'll call it a defense, inside the client, a block to sustained experience of what would be beneficial for them to experience long enough for it to have a prayer of converting into a change in the brain. All right?
Yes.
That's what usually happens. That's what happened for me with many of my clients. That's what happened for me in my own therapy. That's what happens in different ways with our kids, the participants in our human resources, stress management trainings, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. On the other hand, what if, I'll call it level 1, level 2. Level 1, you say, wow, Rick, Tell me more about that experience. What are you feeling? And you would especially nudge me into a more of a kind of foregrounding or highlighting the richly somatic and emotional aspects, not just the conceptual aspects of, the narrative I have about what I'm feeling, my experience, but actually feeling listened to, feeling cared about, feeling appreciated, feeling the compassion of another person. So you would do little things to help me stay with the experience so that those neurons keep firing together, so they gradually start wiring together. You might even add a few things like, wow, Rick, what feels good about feeling seen by me? Highlighting certain things. Or you might say, what is personally relevant or meaningful to you, Rick, about feeling seen and appreciated and respected by me, Nesh, right? What feels good about that? Because you would know that would increase neuroplastic change to highlight the reward value of the experience. Or you might say to me, Rick, can you get a sense? Can you allow that experience to really sink in and spread inside you, so that in effect you kind of give over to it. You let it have you. You let it become established in you. You could do those things. Those would guaranteed. And there's a lot of scattered but very suggestive and plausible research that says that this would increase the conversion in that particular episode of change. It would increase the change in that 2-minute interaction we might have about that particular thing in that particular session. And then level 2, you might say, hey, Rick, I've been increasing the impact of this experience for you by doing things like highlighting or helping you highlight the somatic aspects of it and the reward value of it and its personal relevance for you. And I've highlighted the sense of really internalizing this way of being so it becomes more established in you. And so any resistance to this nonetheless longed for state of being, is released. You're really given over to it. Rick, these are things you can do for yourself in the future. You can have more sense of agency yourself. You can be more of an active learner in a broad sense yourself in social, emotional, positive change by doing these things yourself. In other words, you would be teaching me how to learn. Now, obviously, it's not always appropriate for the therapist to move into that kind of teacher role, right? I was trained psychodynamically initially, so I have a feeling for therapeutic neutrality. But often, especially in more interactive modern forms of therapy, it's perfectly appropriate for a little bit of psychoeducation, as it were, from the therapist so that the client knows increasingly how to be skillful inside their own mind to change their brain, to then change their mind for the better.
It makes so much sense in terms of, I often talk about it in terms of with colleagues, dragging clients through the mud, keeping them in often those two spaces that I'm assuming you would know, because I don't know about it, but I'm sure you would know from a neurological perspective, those two spaces of love and fear. And to activate either of those, we know how profoundly important love is, and you touched on it in terms of someone appreciating another person, or that positive unconditional regard, unconditional positive regard. But also on the flip side, when fear arises, like in experiences where someone might have post traumatic experiences, it's quite often it's something that's occurred for a very short period of time, often just seconds, but it's so intense, and then someone sits in that intensity of fear and confusion and terror, that sticks, and I think we know that 20% of people in those situations that it sticks enough to follow them thereafter, and I'm hearing that you're suggesting that we can all participate in our own learning of stickiness of those traits by spending time, to a point where it's visceral. It's something that we can notice in our limbic system, where we've activated, potentially even teariness in our eyes because we might think about our mother's love toward us, or someone who loves us deeply, to be able to kind of connect and hopefully integrate that. Or we know by science, is what you're saying, it will do that, and we can therefore participate in our own lives in learning moving forward.
Yeah, that's great. And to be really clear, therapy works on average, and it has a very respectable average effect size. Well done studies 30 years ago, even more, on treatments, particularly CBT, manualized kinds of treatments, because they're easier to study, but
Sure.
other kinds of treatments, different treatments, let's say for classic issues, depression or anxiety, had a very robust average effect size of around what's called 0.6 as an effect size. It's essentially 0.6 of a standard deviation of change between the treatment group and the control group, to simplify the statistics that might be making some mathematicians squirm a little as I do this. So that's very good. That's considered a moderate effect size rather than small. It's not super large, but it's significant. On the other hand, as you may, I don't know if you know, the average effect size of treatment today is no better than it was 30 or 40 years ago. So notwithstanding our capacity today to evoke or induce better, more powerful, more interesting experiences for clients, the actual rate of or degree of therapeutic change, response to treatment, is no better today than it was 30, 40 years ago. Now, some people will say, well, honestly, Rick,
That's
holding
incredible.
steady as the world deteriorates around us is good. But on the other hand, there are a lot of measures, not so much in the last 6 months, but over the last 30 years. There are a lot of measures indicating that much of the world has actually gotten better,
A lot
including in
better.
developed parts of the world. Of different kinds of things. So, notwithstanding political discord, particularly, let's say, in my country, America, why aren't we getting a better response to treatment? And my own view is that in the two-stage process of learning, first stage being activation, second being installation, right? State to trait, we have not focused enough on the opportunity of improving installation. And that's where the great opportunity is, including by studying therapists, I'm sure, like yourself, who get effective results with people. How do they do it, right? And how can we teach clients increasingly to do it for themselves? I think, that's full of opportunity. And one key aspect of this is to work backwards from what, if it were more present in the mind of a client, would really help. That's such a key, what if it were more present? So I think about what you said earlier about fear and the profound power of the mindfulness-oriented or acceptance-oriented therapies. Sometimes therapy, is described in waves. So the psychoanalysis, then we had behaviorism,
Sure.
then we had the cognitive revolution, then lately we've had sort of the mindfulness revolution, as it were. Okay, great. It's profoundly powerful to just accept and let be. That's great. And yet, that's hard for many people. What are the inner resources that allow somebody to sit in the fear and disidentify from it, deconstruct it, have insight into its nature as an experience, and not get swept away by that storm? What are the inner strengths, the psychological resources, let's say, that enable a person to do that? And then how can we grow? So inner strengths like distress tolerance, steadiness of mind, internalized felt sense of others who are caring, self-compassion for oneself. These are all different things that enable us to bear our experience. And I did not invent any of them, right? So once we are clear ourselves in our therapeutic formulations or just working with people in general, what would really help? And to know it for our own sake, like myself, what are you working on these days? Like there are a couple of things I'm trying to establish more or develop more as traits in myself. My wife is glad about some of them that I'm working on, and with good reason. And so, I think it's really helpful with our clients to have some clarity and for them to have some clarity. What specifically are we trying to develop? And then we move into the two-step process. Experience what you want to grow and then internalize it again and again and again. Yeah.
It's interesting because, I supervise lots of fellow, colleagues and staff, and seeing new graduates as well develop their craft and their confidence. It's interesting even how much we as human beings, although we play the role of therapist, we're still human, and on that basis we also do tend to have our own avoidance mechanisms, and we know that this idea of integrating by sitting in discomfort or sitting in, whether it be the love or the pain, we're not extending that as much, because there is even a fear in therapists themselves about, I find it uncomfortable watching a client upset, and I don't want to hold them in that upset too long. Yet our training is saying we need to override our own personal stuff and saying you're not going to harm anyone. This is called evidence-based practice, and the evidence tells us if we can do it in a safe space that's comforting and kind, but not avoiding, certainly, stepping into, in actual fact, it allows that space to, I think, use the word grow, that you can kind of internalize that and grow it. Is
That's certainly true. Totally true.
Is that what the studies are saying in terms of your research, that if you stay in it longer, it somehow bonds in our brain, or wires? I think you use the word wires.
Yeah. Well, I think
does that happen?
I want to make it just so. Let's suppose that someone used the example of fear. It's one thing to be with, and I'm going to use a kind of deliberately fuzzy, loaded term, negative. Okay?
Sure.
It's normal. It's human. Sometimes it's adaptive, but we'll just call it a negative experience, or let's say fear. So there's a world of difference between being with an experience, loss, sorrow, anger, addiction. There's a world of difference between being with it and being it. What I mean by that is that if we're being with it mindfully, we're not so identified with it, we're witnessing it, we're feeling it while being disidentified from it. We have it distinct from being swept away by it. We're not hijacked by it, and we're not, therefore, reinforcing it. On the other hand, if we are identified with an experience, hijacked by it, we are going to be reinforcing it. Neurons that fire together wire together, especially, as you know, given the brain's negativity bias, which makes it like Velcro for bad experiences, but Teflon for good ones. So simply just being afraid yet again, or angry yet again, or feeling inadequate yet again, does not release us from that, does not ease us in our relationship to that. It just reinforces it. That's why it's so important to have, as you said, the strong alliance with the therapist, the comfort, the nurturance, the understanding of why I'm opening up to this very uncomfortable material. Those factors then really enable us to be with it in a way that's productive. So, and I think that's an important distinction. So when we talk about simply being with it, with acceptance and so forth, we're talking about that in a way that's skillful, distinct from typical situations, and people simply reinforce negative material by ruminating about it or just kind of being in it, being hijacked by it.
Is that what you mean by that word in sort of the learning space of being curious?
Right. Yeah. So you think about factors, and people like Stephen Hayes, others have really developed, and Freud talked about the observing ego, freely hovering attention. Different people bring different approaches to it. In a more transpersonal psychology, sense. There people talk about finding refuge or resting in the one who knows, the witness, the light of awareness, something, while being aware of terrible sorrow or pain or trauma or loss, right? That's good. And also, we need to cultivate and develop, and also, in addition to simply being with our experience, when, people want to release it. They want to be less afraid. They want to be less sad. They want to be less swept away by their addictive desires, right? They want to be less haunted by what happened to them last year or in their childhood. They want to release. So that part's very important too. Now, sometimes it happens that simply being with difficult, painful material with acceptance itself leads to a full release. It doesn't always, though, and that's why I think therapeutic approaches, including cognitive approaches and behavioral approaches that are trying to release problematic cognitions and behaviors, and then third, after letting be and letting go, we let in. We want to grow alternatives. Instead of fear, we want to develop a sense of confidence and sturdy, gritty strength, let's say. Instead of feelings of inadequacy, worthlessness, shame, we want to develop a healthy sense of worth and feeling valued and appreciated by others, and a sense of our own innate goodness, right? So for me, all three are the territory of truly therapeutic work and personal development in general, letting be, letting go, and letting in. Now, some therapies or approaches are going to emphasize more or the other. I emphasize letting in, the cultivation aspect of practice, because I think that's been the forgotten stepchild in a lot of quarters, and it's really important, and it's forward-looking, and it kind of suits my nature and so forth. But it's absolutely grounded on being with the suffering. We have to start where the Buddha did, with the first fundamental truth: there is suffering, right? As well as letting go. Yeah. What do you make of all that?
Well, I was actually going to ask you, if you don't mind, stepping outside of therapy, how do you personally go about these practices, this cultivation, on a personal level? Many of our listeners, might not be involved in seeing, a counsellor, therapist, but are still on their own personal journey. How do you, to give us some ideas ourselves that we might be able to integrate too? How do you do this in life? What are some of the personal things you do that, whether it's, letting be or letting go or that letting in? What are some of those practices?
Oh, yeah. Well, this little framework, which partly I love nature. It was one of my refuges as a kid, being outdoors in the orange groves around our home in Southern California, and then the hills around the orange groves, and then later in deep wilderness. I like the garden. I like our yard. And I think about these three forms of skillfully engaging the mind. We can witness the garden, we can pull weeds, and we can plant flowers. Let be, let go, let in, right? And so as someone who started out in his 20s with a fix-it orientation to his own mind, I really had to learn what I think you are very grounded in, which is the stance of acceptance and letting be, and just mindful presence, and bearing our suffering without jumping to a solution so fast. So I had to learn that. I've also known other people who are really good at meditating or really good at witnessing their stream of consciousness, and the same neurotic flotsam and jetsam is flowing down the river today that was 20 years ago. They haven't really cultivated. They haven't let in. They haven't particularly either let go or let in. So both are really important. But for me, letting be is the fundamental practice. It's where we start. It's often our last resort, because that's all we can do is ride out the storm, just not pour gasoline on the fire. So I try to feel what I feel, really stay with it, be honest about it. And then fairly soon, there's kind of a shift into letting go. And I find that if my letting go and letting in doesn't have traction, I need to go back to letting be. And I think that's true if we work with people or we have conversations with people. If we jump too quickly into solving, sometimes there's low-hanging fruit. And, the material is familiar, like, oh, okay, I know that inner script, I know that movie, I know that voice in my head, heard it a million times, moving on, we move into letting go. But other times, we just need to go back to it and stay with it. So I'll shift into letting go. And then a lot of my practice is to rest my mind on what draws my heart. And what I mean by that is I think in all of us is a knowing of the growing edge, right? What are we kind of loving into being, growing into being, trying to establish? If it's already well established in us, there's not a lot of growth value in focusing on it because we got it. You know what I mean? Like learning how to lift a coffee cup. I got that. I got that one a while ago. I'm not going to get a lot of value trying to get better at lifting my coffee cup. On the other hand, using chopsticks skillfully, I've got something to learn still about that. So that's the growing edge. So there are things that I focus on myself and try to help them become more established in myself. So I would just, I know you're asking for kind of more experience talk, and
No, that's fine.
I find, there's an intimacy where we come into the kind of growing and learning I'm talking about is very embodied. It's very, you're in it. You're intimate with your own experience. And there's a quality of humility in it in which you give yourself the gift of receiving what you long for so that actually you crave it less. Paradoxically, by really reaching for it in hopefully skillful and not too annoying to others ways, you reach for it and then you let yourself have it. You stay with it and you help the animal body, kind of come home and feel it and receive it. Then increasingly it's in you. You're there. So that's how I am. And I mean, I could be more specific if you want, but that's, I would say, pretty much how it is.
I think much more said there, using that appreciation, understanding of, connecting with one's heart and yearning than, the processes, I think it's a beautiful experience of, gardening, of, the different processes that are occurring. And when you genuinely are out there embracing gardening versus I'm running out there to do all the weeding, two different worlds. So that's, I think, very beautifully said. Yeah. Rick, we have so much to, learn and talk about, but obviously, unfortunately, we don't have all the time in the world. Yeah. How can people find out more about you? Where can they find out more about your books? I know that you do, online courses, that you do teachings as well and seminars. How do we find out more about, Rick, and where to find you?
Oh, I appreciate that. I do. So just my website, rickhanson.net. Tons and tons of freely offered resources. And if you'll indulge me, actually, I'll just name here some very, very practical things that people can do.
Please.
I'll do it in a real summary way. So first, with regard to this time of COVID, a plague, sweeping the world, and also a time when, certainly in America, I don't know about Australia, but we're grappling with a long overdue reckoning with racial injustice in our country. We're also grappling with a long overdue reckoning with what actually happens when there's been 30 years of attack on the even basic notion of the common good, the common welfare, the commons altogether. What do you do? So when things are crazy, when they're nutty, when the bottom is falling out beneath your feet, three things. First, find your footing. Find your footing. Where are you? What are the facts? What are your values? What's your plan? find your footing. And then calm and center. Do whatever you need to do to calm down, to center, and be strong. And third, tend and befriend. That phrase from the work of Shelley Taylor at UCLA, take care of others and reach out to others. For me, those are three big headlines. Find your footing, calm and center, and tend and befriend. And then another list of three is really overarching, and in some ways it relates to our whole discussion of the garden and the three great practices and how to balance being with and working with the mind. I think deal with the bad, turn to the good, take in the good. That way of looking at it, deal with the bad, turn to the good, and take in the good, is not positive thinking. It's not rose-colored glasses. It means dealing with real issues outside you or inside you. And meanwhile, turn to the good. Recognize what is also true. Recognize those experiences, those states that would be beneficial if they were more active in your mind right now, more present in you, more rested in your heart. And take them in. Help them land. Help them sink in. And then the last thing I'll just offer, very, very practically, I come back to it again and again. If you ask me, what do? Slow down, take a breath, breathe, and notice when it's true that in the present, you're basically all right now. It doesn't have to be perfect, and you may not be all right in the future. You may not have been basically all right in the past, but usually when you slow down and don't let others hurry you along so much and don't let yourself put yourself under pressure, slow down and breathe. Feel your body as a whole. And in the present, notice you're basically okay. The house is not burning down in the moment. The shark is not chewing on your leg in the moment. There's no shocking loss in the moment. You can kind of settle in. Okay. Thanks for indulging me there with my practical tips at the end here.
No, thank you. I think that's a nice place to, wrap up. And, ladies and gentlemen, Rick Hanson, please look him up, rickhanson.net. Plenty of information there to find out more and, continue on with your own personal journey. Thanks, Rick.
Oh, thank you, Nesh. It's been a pleasure.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please support it by going to iTunes and putting a review, subscribe, share it via social media, and tell others about it. Start a conversation. It's listeners like you that make this able and possible, and why we bring in these guests to go out and share their knowledge and resources. And just lastly, if you are a psychologist and you want to go out and be part of a bigger team, develop your experience and get into some exciting work, come to strategicpsychology.com.au/careers and reach out. I'd love to hear from you.